Sometimes the biggest mysteries don't arrive with noise. They arrive quietly, soft enough that most people never notice, small enough that scientists almost ignore them. But this story begins with one of those quiet moments, a tiny tilt, a barely visible nudge in the darkness, a change so slight that only the most patient eyes on Earth could see it. For months, astronomers tracked an interstellar visitor named 3I/Atlas, a cold traveler drifting through space. Silent, predictable, almost boring. It was supposed to pass our sun on a clean, well-behaved path, a smooth arc across the sky, following the same rules every comet follows. Gravity. Momentum. Nothing strange. At least, that's what everyone believed. But on a still night, inside a small Hawaiian observatory, the first hint appeared. A shift. So tiny at first that it looked like a glitch on the screen. The kind of thing you blink away and forget. Except this time, the glitch didn't go away. The astronomer on duty zoomed in, rechecked the coordinates, made sure the tracking system wasn't drifting. And the more he stared at the numbers, the more the feeling sank in. 3I/Atlas wasn't where it was supposed to be. It had moved sideways, just a fraction of a degree, barely enough to notice, but enough to break its predicted path, enough to break the map of the sky. He ran the data again and again and again. Every test gave the same result. The object had shifted on its own. At first, he kept calm. Space is chaotic. Tiny forces act on objects all the time. Solar pressure, outgassing, thermal jets. There were explanations, at least in theory. But the more he checked the motion, the more those explanations fell apart. There were no jets, no sudden bursts of gas, no extra light, no spin change. This wasn't a natural drift. It was a choice, or something that looked a lot like one. So he called another observatory, then another. Soon, telescopes across the world were pointed at the same small dot, and every one of them confirmed the impossible. 3I/Atlas had broken the ecliptic, the invisible sheet most objects travel on. It had stepped off the path, like a person stepping off a sidewalk and walking into the street. Astronomers froze. Some stared in silence. Others laughed nervously, unsure what they were seeing. Because objects don't do that. They don't shift direction without a force. They don't tilt their trajectory in a clean, controlled way. They don't glide sideways, like they're responding to something. But that's exactly how the object moved. Slow, smooth, deliberate, almost careful. At that moment, people inside observatories began to feel something they rarely admit: unease. The sky is supposed to be predictable. It's supposed to follow math. It's supposed to behave. But when something from outside our solar system arrives, and then changes course with no physical reason, it breaks more than just a model. It breaks a belief. Scientists across the world rushed to update their predictions. Supercomputers ran simulations late into the night. Every new model tried to explain that tilt. Every new attempt failed. Again and again, the software hit the same wall. There was no force to explain the motion. Not gravity, not sunlight, not mass loss. Nothing. It was like trying to explain why a feather suddenly falls upward. One researcher described it best. It felt like the universe looked us in the eye and blinked. The shift wasn't big. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic or loud. But it was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. And sometimes the smallest wrong thing is the one you should fear the most. As days passed, the object kept moving, but its new path had a strange elegance, a curve that looked stable, almost too stable. It wasn't tumbling, it wasn't wobbling, it wasn't correcting itself like a natural body would. If anything, it looked like the shift was intentional. Astronomers started whispering things they'd never say on record. Why does it look like it's steering? What is it avoiding? What changed when it entered the inner system? The questions grew louder, but the answers never came. Because 3I/Atlas didn't slow down. It didn't behave like a comet. It didn't behave like anything they had seen before. And the more they studied the shift, the more impossible it became. One scientist compared the motion to a bird banking in the air, not drifting, but choosing. Another stared at the trajectory for hours before saying quietly, "It's like it knew we were watching." Nobody laughed at that. Not this time, because deep down, something didn't feel random anymore. The space around the object didn't show debris. There were no dust tails, no heat flares, no signs of an outgassing event strong enough to move it. Just silence. Just motion. Just a tiny tilt in the dark. But sometimes a small tilt is the loudest message of all. By the end of the week, the scientific papers began to shift in tone. Less certain, more cautious, more aware that something wasn't right. The words non-gravitational acceleration appeared again and again. A sterile way of saying, it moved, and we don't know why. And somewhere between those lines, a quiet fear began to spread. If an object can change its path without a force, then what else can it do? If it can break the rules of motion, what rules is it following? And if it didn't behave like a natural thing, then what was it? The world didn't know it yet, but that tiny shift was the start of something much bigger. Because in space, objects don't move without a reason. Not comets, not rocks, not wanderers drifting through the void. So the question hangs there, quiet and heavy. Why would a drifting body change course with no force acting on it? The answer would come soon, and when it did, it would change everything. Sometimes the universe speaks in flashes, not words, not sound, just light. Soft, measured, intentional. And that's exactly what happened when 3I/Atlas began to turn. At first it looked ordinary, just another shift in rotation as it moved through space. Slow, calm, predictable. But then something new appeared, something that made astronomers sit up straight in their chairs. The object began to pulse. Every 91 seconds, a clean, sharp rise in brightness. Not random, not messy, perfect. Like a heartbeat in the dark. Across the world, observatories caught the same pattern. The peaks lined up to the second, synchronized, steady, almost stubbornly stable. One researcher stared at the graph and whispered, "This can't be real." Because natural objects don't pulse like that. Not with timing this exact, not with a rhythm that refuses to break. The first few hours were filled with denial. It's noise. It's our equipment. It's a flaw in the software. But every test said the same thing. The rhythm was real, and it wasn't fading. It was getting stronger. Telescopes in Chile, Hawaii, Japan, South Africa, all saw the same rising curve. Every 91 seconds, light poured off 3I/Atlas like a slow, steady breath. Bright, then quiet, bright, then quiet again. Over and over. Astronomers tried to force their minds into natural explanations. Maybe sunlight was bouncing off ice. Maybe jets of gas were firing at perfect intervals. Maybe the rotation rate just happened to match the pulse. But deep down, everyone felt the same thing. Nature doesn't beat like a metronome. Not for minutes, not for hours, not for days, and definitely not with a rhythm this clean. As the data grew, the pattern only became stranger, instead of flickering randomly, like comets usually do. 3I/Atlas shined with a precision that looked engineered. Every pulse rose to almost the same height. Every dip fell to almost the same quiet level. It was too neat, too smooth, too alive. One scientist described it perfectly. It was like watching a lighthouse, but with no hand to guide it. As the object turned deeper into the sunlight, its brightness should have scattered. It should have wobbled or flickered with dust. But instead, the pulse tightened. The 91-second interval didn't drift, not even by a fraction. If anything, the signal became sharper, cleaner, more deliberate, like something inside the object was adjusting itself, correcting its aim, refining its voice. By the second night, the tone of the research rooms changed. People stopped talking casually, stopped laughing, stopped pretending this was a normal comet, doing normal comet things. Screens glowed with graphs repeating the same pattern. Timestamps lined up like clockwork, and everywhere, in every corner of every lab, the same question hung in the air. What is it trying to tell us? Because at some point, the idea of reflectivity stopped making sense. This wasn't sunlight bouncing. This wasn't dust scattering. This wasn't rotation. This was too intentional. When one team isolated the signal, something even stranger appeared. The pulse wasn't just brightening. There was a subtle rise, a pause, then a sudden drop, almost like an electrical waveform, almost like something was powering on, then powering off. And the longer they watched, the more the behavior changed. The brightness didn't stay steady. It grew, little by little, pulse by pulse, like something was waking up. Imagine watching a heartbeat monitor where every beat grows louder, stronger, more present. That's what the astronomers were seeing. At first, most of them didn't want to say the word signal. It felt too big, too dangerous, too easy to misunderstand. But the more they studied the light curve, the harder it became to ignore the truth creeping in. This was not random, not natural, not simple. Something was happening inside 3I/Atlas, something that had timing, structure, consistency. One researcher stared at her screen for almost an hour before finally whispering the thought everyone else was afraid to say out loud. What if it's not a heartbeat? What if it's a code? Her voice shook as she said it, not because she believed the answer, but because she feared what it might mean. Signals, real signals, don't show up in perfect cycles. They drift, they decay, they break. But this one didn't. Every 91 seconds, every single time. The same rising flare, the same soft fall, as if someone or something wanted to make sure we noticed. The strangest moment came near dawn, when the pulse suddenly doubled in strength. No warning, no slow build, just a sudden surge of light, bright enough that one observatory thought their sensors were burning out. They weren't. The object simply shined harder, And that's when fear truly entered the room. Because at that moment, every astronomer understood something they didn't want to admit. The object wasn't just reflecting light, it was producing it. That realization changed everything. Natural bodies don't do that. Not comets, not asteroids, not anything drifting through space without power or purpose. To generate light, you need energy, you need structure. You need something that can pulse on command. So the question grew darker. Is this the first hint of something controlled? Not just a signal, not just a message, but a system, a function, an action, something intentional. And with every passing hour, the pulse kept growing. 91 seconds, then 91 more, then 91 more, each brighter than the last. Each sharper, each clearer, as if the object was focusing, aligning, or reaching for something. By sunrise, the world had changed. The shift in Chapter 1 had broken the orbit. But this pulse, broke something deeper. It broke the boundary between natural and unnatural. It made scientists look at the sky differently. It made them wonder if we were watching something come alive. And as the brightness climbed, one final question rose with it. Soft, quiet, impossible to ignore. If this isn't just reflectivity, if this is a signal, then who or what is sending it? And why does the pulse keep getting stronger? Sometimes, the scariest part of a message is not the sound it makes. It's the silence that follows. And that's exactly what scientists found when they looked deeper into the strange pulse coming from 3IATLAS. For days, the world was focused on the brightness, those sharp, steady flashes every 90 seconds. The heartbeat pattern in the dark. The rhythm no one could explain. But hidden underneath that light, buried inside all the noise, there was something else, something colder, quieter, and somehow even more unnatural. It started with a simple idea. What if we're missing something between the pulses? So a team in Chile took raw data from the last 48 hours and ran it through every filter they had. They removed cosmic rays. They removed background scatter. They stripped away the sun's glare, the dust, and the electronic static. And when the final layer fell away, everyone in the room froze. Because the object wasn't just getting brighter, it was getting quiet. Between every flare of light, between every heartbeat, there was a sudden, perfect drop into darkness. A silence so clean, it didn't belong in space. Not even deep space is truly silent. There's always some noise, photons, heat, dust, randomness. But the gap between Atlas's pulses was different. It wasn't noise. It wasn't randomness. It was absence, like someone flipping a switch and holding it down. The scientists ran the filter again, and again, and again. Every time, the same strange picture appeared. Bright pulse, perfect silence. Bright pulse, perfect silence. Over and over. No drift, no decay, no natural unevenness. It looked too precise, too intentional. One researcher stared at the screen and whispered, "It's pausing." Another added quietly, "It's waiting." There was something unsettling about that gap, not because it was empty, but because it felt designed. Natural objects don't pause. They don't turn themselves off and then on again, with timing that stays perfect for days. Nature flickers. Nature wobbles. Nature makes mistakes. This didn't. This felt like the object was choosing when to speak and when to stay silent. And once that idea sank in, everyone felt the same cold ripple inside their chest. Because if the silence is deliberate, then so is the light. Teams from Japan and Europe tested the data on different machines. Some tried new methods, others used old ones, hoping the silence would disappear as a glitch, but it didn't. It grew sharper. The gap lasted exactly the same length every single time, a thin slice of darkness cut with mathematical precision. One scientist compared it to breathing. The inhale was the brightness. The exhale was nothing. Except this thing wasn't alive, and it wasn't supposed to breathe. When the discovery went public, forums lit up with theories, some harmless, some wild, some that made scientists wince. People asked if it was a message, a beacon, a repeating signal meant for someone or something to hear. Others wondered if the silence was part of the pattern, like space between notes in a song, or the pause between words in a sentence. But the question that terrified the scientific community the most was simple. Why would any natural body create silence on purpose? Space doesn't do purpose. It doesn't stop and start. It doesn't pulse on fixed intervals. The deeper observatories zoomed in, the stranger the silence became. There were edges, sharp ones. Like the moment the light faded, it wasn't fading. It was cut, not dimming, not drifting, just gone, instantly. Then, after the silence, it snapped back to full brightness, as if a switch had been thrown again. This was no thermal process, no gas jet, no dust cloud. This was control. Artificial or not, something was regulating the light. By the end of the week, scientists stopped calling the gap a silence. They started calling it the dead window, a term used in machine diagnostics. Machines pause. Machines reset. Machines wait between actions. But comets? Never. One researcher in Scandinavia wrote in her notes, "It feels like it's thinking." She later crossed the sentence out. But the idea lingered, because that's what the gap looked like. A moment of thought, a moment of stillness, a moment of intention. A few scientists even noticed something darker. The silence wasn't just a break between pulses. It was growing more defined, sharper, cleaner, as if the object was improving the cycle, optimizing it, learning. That idea shook even the bravest minds in the room. Because if something is learning, then something is aware. The world wasn't ready for that idea. Most still aren't. But when you look at the light curve, when you stare at that perfect cut of silence, you can't help but feel a chill. It's not what a comet would do. It's not what an asteroid would do. It's not what nature would do. It's what a system would do. A device. A mechanism. A machine. And if the silence is the key, then the real question becomes something far heavier. Who or what is behind that silence? Is it a signal? A reset? A heartbeat? A scan? A countdown? Or is it something we haven't even learned to fear yet? As the scientists argued, as theories collided in late-night rooms full of glowing screens, one thing became painfully clear. The object wasn't just brightening, it was communicating in a pattern that no natural fragment of rock should ever be able to make. And in the gap between the flashes, in that cold slice of emptiness, something waited. Something patient, something deliberate, something unknown. The next chapter would reveal a truth even stranger than the silence. Because if the light curve was unsettling, The heat coming from the object was about to break every model ever written. The story of 3I/Atlas was only just beginning. Sometimes, the truth doesn't hide in the light. It hides in the heat. The strange pulses from 3I/Atlas were already shaking the scientific world. A perfect heartbeat in the dark, a silence carved between each flash. But then the infrared data arrived, and everything became even stranger. Infrared cameras had been pointed at the object for days, quietly collecting readings. Most scientists expected the same simple heat profile you'd see on any comet. Cold, chaotic, uneven. Something natural, something harmless. But when the first thermal map appeared on the screens, people leaned in, then froze. Because the surface of 3I/Atlas wasn't chaotic at all. It wasn't uneven. It wasn't random. It was organized. Patches of heat moved across the object, with the smooth precision of panels turning themselves toward the sun. Cooling zones shifted in patterns that repeated every few minutes. Everything looked coordinated. One scientist whispered, "This looks mechanical." Another answered with a shaky breath, "This looks intentional." Most comets heat up in messy bursts. Sunlight strikes a frozen surface. Ice turns to gas, and the heat scatters like a firecracker. But 3I/Atlas didn't scatter. Its hot zones slid from one region to another, like pieces on a board, structured, timed, controlled. It felt like the surface was responding to something, as if it could sense the sunlight and adjust its skin with purpose. In normal science, there's no rulebook for behavior like this. No equation, no model. Nothing that explains hot and cold, moving like living muscle. So teams ran the data again. They changed instruments. They checked for errors. They cleaned the sensors. Anything to avoid the impossible. But the patterns stayed. Sharp, crisp, almost beautiful in their precision. One heat zone would brighten, not gradually, not slowly, but instantly. As if a panel had rotated into place. Seconds later, a cold band at the far side would shift, cooling as if it had turned away from the sun. It was rhythm, not chaos, and rhythm always means something. As the hours passed, scientists traced each thermal shift. They lined up every movement against the object's rotation, its distance from the sun, its pulse cycle. And that's when another strange truth appeared. The thermal shifts were synchronized with the 91-second light pulses. Heat rose, light flared, heat fell. Silence returned, like the surface was breathing in perfect time with the signal. That realization chilled the room, because heat changes on this scale require energy, coordination, a system, not an accident, not a natural outgassing, not sunlight alone, a system. And if something has a system, then something built it. One researcher in Japan stared at the patterns and said, "This looks like thermal regulation." Another corrected him quietly, "No, it looks like preparation." That word hung in the air like cold smoke. Preparation. For what? No one could agree. A few whispered about solar alignment, as if the object was adjusting itself to absorb maximum energy. Others suggested shielding, like the hot zones were protecting something underneath or hiding a deeper structure. But the most unsettling theory came from a small team working in silence late into the night. They noticed that the thermal zones weren't just shifting randomly. They were moving toward a pattern closer and closer to perihelion, the moment the object would be closest to the sun. Each day, the alignment grew sharper, cleaner, more strategic, like pieces sliding into place, like preparation for an event, a transformation, a reveal, a moment. And the closer the object drifted to the sun, the more the heat patterns looked like a machine warming up or waking up. Scientists hated the thought, but the thermal data continued to push them toward that cliff. Because comets don't regulate heat. Comets don't redirect energy. Comets don't respond to sunlight like they're choosing what to do with it. Machines do. Technology does. Systems do. Every new thermal image told the same story. This wasn't random behavior. This wasn't nature. This was intention, and intention is always the most frightening part. By the middle of the week, the thermal zones began concentrating on one side of the object, not around its poles, not around its spin axis, but toward the direction of its new, shifted path, the path that had broken the ecliptic. Almost like the object was focusing on where it was going, almost like it was pointing. That idea changed everything. What if the tilt from Chapter 1 wasn't a mistake? What if the heartbeat in Chapter 2 wasn't a glitch? What if the silence in Chapter 3 wasn't just an empty pause? What if all of it, every signal, every pattern, every shift, was building towards something? A decision, a purpose, a moment waiting to happen at perihelion. The closer 3I/Atlas drifted to the sun, the more the thermal behavior resembled the warm-up sequence of something preparing to activate. Not geological heat, not chemical heat. Strategic heat. Heat with direction. One team described the pattern as panels opening and closing, even though no one dared to say those exact words in a formal report. Panels. Moving, adjusting, changing. No scientist wanted to believe it, but no scientist could deny it either. And deep down, everyone felt the same quiet fear. This object wasn't reacting. It was preparing for the sun, preparing for perihelion, preparing for whatever happens when a system like this receives enough energy. Nobody knew what it would become. Nobody knew what it was waiting for. But the thermal patterns told one truth even the bravest researchers couldn't ignore. Whatever 3I/Atlas truly is, it hasn't revealed itself yet. The real shape, the real purpose, the real identity is still hidden beneath those shifting panels of heat. And the moment of perihelion is getting closer, much closer. The next chapter will bring us to that moment, the point where preparation ends, and whatever is inside finally wakes up. There are moments in space when everything feels like it's holding its breath. Moments when the patterns stop looking random and start looking alive. And as 3I/Atlas drifted closer to the sun, that feeling grew stronger than ever. For weeks, scientists had watched the strange visitor break the rules one by one. Its path shifting, its light pulsing like a heartbeat, its surface heating with mechanical precision. But now, something new was happening. Something that didn't feel like physics anymore. Something that felt like anticipation. Because the closer the object came to perihelion, its closest point to the sun, the more it behaved like it was preparing for a moment. A threshold, an activation, an awakening. The first clue came with the pulse, the 91-second rhythm that had defined the object from the beginning began to change, not break, not distort, but quicken. 89 seconds, then 87, Then 84. Each beat came faster, sharper, more urgent, like a heart racing with adrenaline. Astronomers stared at their screens as the pulses lined up with a precision that didn't falter for even a fraction of a second. Whatever was happening inside the object was accelerating. Its rhythm was rising. Its energy was climbing. And then the heat followed. Infrared cameras lit up with new patterns no comet had ever produced. The warm zones expanded. Cold zones tucked inward. The shifting panels from the previous chapter started locking into place, as if the entire surface was rearranging itself for something the sun would trigger. Temperatures climbed higher than any model predicted, far too high for a frozen body, far too stable for a natural structure. It wasn't just warming, it was powering up. On the same day, another strange behavior appeared. The object began slowing down. Most comets spin faster as they approach the sun, like a skater pulling their arms in. But 3I/Atlas did the opposite. Its rotation eased, then eased again, then dropped to a near standstill. Slow, smooth, controlled, like a machine bracing itself before absorbing a massive surge of energy. That moment changed everything. Because slowing rotation is a choice. It's a preparation. It's the kind of action that only makes sense if the object knew what was coming next. A researcher at NASA described it as watching something hold steady for impact. Another wrote in her notes, "It's facing the sun intentionally." The idea sounded impossible. And yet, every measurement supported it. The slowing rotation aligned the largest heated zone directly toward the sun. Not almost, not roughly, perfectly. Each hour brought the object closer to a position that looked deliberate, strategic, like a dish pointing toward a signal, like a flower turning toward the light, like an eye opening. Meanwhile, the pulse continued to speed up. 78 seconds, 75, 72. With each shift, the spikes grew brighter, and the silent gaps became even sharper, as if something inside the object was focusing its signal into a tighter, cleaner form. The world began to wonder, was this communication or transformation? Was the object waking up or warning us? No one had answers, but everyone felt the same unease. Because when you watch an object from another star, change its rhythm, shape its heat, slow its rotation, and turn its brightest face toward the sun, it's hard not to feel like you're watching something come alive. By the time perihelion was only days away, every telescope on Earth and every satellite in orbit was locked onto a single dot in the sky. A dot that looked more intentional with every passing hour. Some scientists stayed awake for days, afraid to miss even a single measurement. The data kept shifting, kept tightening, kept building toward something. One team noticed the pulse wasn't just speeding up. It was sinking. The thermal patterns, the brightness flares, the rotational changes, they were all falling into alignment, like gears in a machine locking into place before it begins to move. It no longer looked like geology. It no longer looked like physics. It looked like behavior. Something was preparing. Something was waiting for a moment only the sun could trigger. The final hours before perihelion felt like the quiet before a storm. The object stopped changing, stopped heating, stopped rotating. Everything held steady, a perfect stillness, a perfect alignment. As if every system inside that strange interstellar body had reached its final position. and for the first time since it entered our solar system, the light pulse vanished. No flash at 72 seconds, or 71, or 73, just silence. A silence deeper than the one from Chapter 3, a silence that felt heavy, intentional, waiting. Scientists stared at empty monitors with breathless horror. Because whatever 3I/Atlas was doing, it was done preparing. No movement, no heat shift, no heartbeat, just a cold, waiting object pointing directly at the sun. And then the sun rose behind it. In that moment, no one knew what would happen. Would it ignite? Would it open? Would it break apart? Would it reveal what was inside? Or would it do something we weren't ready to imagine? This was the moment every pattern had been building toward. This was the moment the object had slowed for. This was the moment the pulses had prepared for. Perihelion. The point of closest approach. The point of maximum energy. The point of awakening. And the only question left was, what happens when something not of this world finally meets the sun? The answer is, waiting in the next chapter. There are moments in science when the data feels almost aware. Not because it speaks, not because it moves, but because it reacts in ways nothing natural ever should. And as 3I/Atlas swung past perihelion, another layer of its mystery peeled open, a layer made not of heat, not of motion, but of light. For weeks, astronomers had tracked the object's brightness. They'd watched the strange pulses, the silent gaps, the rising heat, and the slow, almost purposeful rotation. But then something new appeared, something sharper. Something that didn't look like geology at all. Its reflectivity changed, not softly, like dust scattering sunlight, not randomly, like ice crystals tumbling through space, but suddenly, instantly, with angles. The first time it happened, scientists thought they were seeing a glitch, a spike on the graph that didn't belong anywhere. A patch on the object's surface brightened with impossible efficiency, like a mirror snapping into place. A second later, the brightness dropped again, as if that mirror had folded away. It was too fast to be natural, too sharp to be dust, too clean to be chance. So they watched again. And then it happened again and again. Tiny regions on 3I/Atlas kept flashing with unnatural clarity, high reflectivity bursts that formed and vanished as if someone were opening and closing sections of its surface. One researcher whispered, "It looks like panels." Another replied, "It looks like control." Because reflectivity doesn't behave like that. Natural dust surfaces are messy, chaotic. They scatter light in every direction. But this object reflected light with angles, edges, boundaries, the kind of geometry you only see in engineered surfaces. The more they watched, the clearer the pattern became. The flashes weren't random. They lined up with the sun. They lined up with the rotation. They even lined up with the pulse cycle that had defined the object since the beginning. Heat, light, reflectivity, all moving in sync, all adjusting with purpose, all behaving like parts of a single system. Working together, spectral readings revealed another unsettling detail. The high reflectivity regions weren't made of dust or ice. They had a smoothness, a consistency that no natural object shared. It was like polished metal, or composite, or something even stranger, something built. Teams across the world began to feel the weight of that possibility. Because if these surfaces were engineered, then the object was no longer a comet. It was something wearing a comet, like a shell, a disguise, a layer meant to survive deep space while something else slept inside. One scientist wrote in her notes, "The shell is thinning near the reflectivity spikes. Something underneath is interacting with the sun." She later deleted the sentence, but the fear behind it didn't go away. As 3I/Atlas continued to turn, the reflective bursts grew more coordinated. They didn't just appear, they responded. If the sun shifted, they shifted back. If the object rotated, they compensated. If the pulse quickened, the reflections sharpened to match. It was like watching shutters on a machine open and close with perfect timing. Nothing natural acts like shutters. Nothing drifting freely through space adjusts to sunlight that quickly. Nothing frozen under ancient ice behaves like it understands where the light is coming from. And yet, that's exactly what this object did. One team described the pattern as a field of light turning itself on and off. Another called it directional reflectivity. But a small group in Europe used a different phrase, a phrase that spread through the scientific community like a whisper. Reflectivity that thinks, because that's what it looked like, not random brightness, not sunlight bouncing around, but thought, awareness, response, intention. Scientists tried to ground themselves. They ran simulations. They compared the object to icy asteroids, to carbon-rich comets, to the weirdest rocks in the Kuiper Belt. Nothing matched. Nothing came close. Not even the bizarre behavior of Oumuamua, the first interstellar visitor ever recorded, could explain these sharp flashes that looked like hinged plates turning toward and away from the sun. And the closer they looked, the more terrifying the truth became. The reflective surfaces weren't scattered randomly across the object. They were arranged, geometric, symmetrical, almost patterned. Sections that brightened in triangles, others that dimmed in rectangles. Lines that formed edges far too straight to be natural fractures, like pieces of armor shifting into place. Like solar panels unfurling, like something inside the object was slowly revealing itself. One researcher finally said it out loud. "This is a shell, and the shell is opening." No one argued, because the reflectivity data kept showing the same thing. Parts of the surface were thinning, pulling back, exposing cleaner, brighter material underneath, material that didn't belong on any comet. The outer layer was shedding, the inner layer was waking. The behavior grew more active as the object drifted farther from the sun, not less. That part confused everyone. Usually, comets fall apart only near the sun when heat rips them open. But 3I/Atlas was doing the opposite. It was becoming more organized, more structured, more deliberate as it moved away. Panels continued shifting into alignment. Reflectivity spikes formed perfect grids. Surfaces began folding into shapes no natural body would ever create. And slowly, painfully, a truth began to form in the minds of scientists everywhere. Whatever this thing is, it is not made of stone. It is not made of dust. It is not made of chance. It is something built, something ancient, something hiding inside a shell that is finally breaking away. And the question that haunted everyone was the simplest and the darkest. What machine hides inside a comet? Because the object was no longer pretending. The shell was no longer holding. Something underneath was finally pushing through. Something that could reflect. something that could respond, something that could think. And whatever it wasn't here by accident. The next chapter will reveal the pattern hidden beneath the reflectivity, a pattern that no natural object has ever produced, a pattern that might change the story forever. Sometimes the universe doesn't hide its secrets in objects. It hides them in the paths they take, not in what something is, but in how it moves. And when analysts finally mapped the strange flashes coming from 3I/Atlas, they uncovered something that froze entire research teams in silence. Because the object wasn't just pulsing, it wasn't just reflecting, it wasn't just shifting, it was writing, in motion, like a message drawn across space. For weeks, scientists had been collecting thousands of brightness points. Every flare, every dip, every 91-second pulse, every angle of reflectivity. Most thought they were random artifacts, pieces of scattered data that didn't mean anything on their own. But one analyst in Europe had a different thought. What if we stop looking at the pulses as moments and start looking at them as a map? So they plotted each pulse in 3 dimensions, not on the surface of the object, but along its entire trajectory, like stars in a constellation. And that was the moment reality cracked, because the pulses didn't scatter randomly. They didn't drift. They didn't spread out. They aligned perfectly. Each flare formed a point. Each point formed a line. Each line formed a grid, a geometric pattern stretching behind the object, like a trail of light and silence. A grid too straight to be coincidence, too clean to be chaos, too exact to be anything born from nature. Analysts stared at the model in disbelief. The object wasn't just moving, it was tracing something, a structure, a blueprint, a pattern that shouldn't exist. One researcher whispered, "This looks like someone drew it." Another corrected him softly, "No, something." The grid repeated every few hours, layering itself behind the object as it drifted through space. Lines crossed at 90 degrees. Shapes formed perfect rectangles. The spacing remained consistent, even when the object changed speed. Natural bodies don't do that. Comets don't leave geometric footprints. Asteroids don't create repeating paths. The grid looked like intention, like math with purpose, like architecture. And that's when a deeper truth emerged. The pattern wasn't just behind the object, it was ahead of it too. The pulses were predicting where the object would be hours before it arrived, as if the signal was planning the path, not following it. For the first time, analysts considered a terrifying possibility. This isn't a map of what the object has done. It's a map of what it intends to do. The thought shook even the calmest minds. Because only 2 things can draw patterns like that: intelligence or instructions. The grid looked too deliberate to be instinct, too consistent to be accident, too structured to be survival behavior. It looked like programming, as if something inside 3I/Atlas was following instructions written long ago, instructions that carved a geometric trail through the solar system. As teams dug deeper, the pattern grew even stranger. Sections of the grid matched shapes in sacred geometry, ratios found in ancient symbols, patterns seen in nature's deepest laws, not perfect copies, but echoes, as if the design was built on universal math that transcends biology and culture. One astronomer said quietly, "It's as if the object is using geometry as a language." Another responded, "A language meant to be understood, but by who?" Because the more the pattern unfolded, the more it looked like communication. Not sound, not radio, not light in a vacuum, but movement, motion written like sentences. A message carved into the sky by the path of an interstellar traveler. If the object was speaking, then every pulse was a letter. Every shift was a word. Every geometric line was part of a sentence, and that begged the question no one wanted to confront. Who is the message meant for? Earth? The sun? Something else in the void? Something following behind it? Something waiting ahead? No one knew. But the message was there, laid out in a grid of perfect lines that only grew clearer with every pulse. One analyst noticed something even more chilling. The grid pointed somewhere, a straight line at the center of the geometry, extended far into deep space, not toward Earth, not toward the sun, but toward a region with nothing in it. At least, nothing we know today. Some believed it was a destination. Others thought it was a memory, a map of where it came from, a breadcrumb trail of its origin. But one small team noticed something different. The lines weren't just pointing into space. They were pointing toward time, the object's trajectory, when extended far enough, connected with an ancient orbital path that Earth passed millions of years ago, a place our planet hasn't visited in ages. Was that coincidence? Or was the object aiming for a point in both space and history? Late one night, an analyst said the words everyone had been too scared to say. What if this is a reply? Suddenly the room fell silent. Because if it's a reply, that means someone spoke first. Maybe millions of years ago. Maybe from our planet. Maybe from another civilization that sent out a signal long before humans appeared. A signal that 3IATLAS is only now echoing back. The grid, the reflectivity, the thermal shifts, the pulses, the silence. Together they looked less like clues and more like components of a message we haven't learned how to read yet. A message written in motion across the canvas of the solar system. And it left the world with one question that sank deep into the minds of everyone watching. If this is a signal, who or what is the intended recipient? Because messages are never written for no one. They always have a destination, a listener, a meaning. And somewhere in the next chapter, that meaning will reveal something even more unsettling. This object does not seem to come from anywhere we recognize, or anywhere a natural body should. Some mysteries begin with what we see. Others begin with what we don't. And this one begins with an absence so large, so unsettling, that it made the world stop and ask a question we never thought we'd face. How does something enter our solar system without coming from anywhere? For months, astronomers had tracked 3I/Atlas as it moved through our system with impossible behavior. The tilt, the pulses, the silence, the heat, the shifting panels, the geometric trail. But now, as the object pushed farther away from the sun, scientists turned their attention backward. Back along its path, back across the sky, back across time, to find where this thing was born. That's where the real nightmare began. Because every interstellar object we've ever found, every rock, every comet, every wanderer, points back to something. A star, a system, a birthplace. But when analysts traced the trajectory of 3I/Atlas further and further into deep space, the answers didn't line up. They disappeared. The first calculations pointed toward a region far outside our local star neighborhood. Cold, empty, distant. So they checked again, and again, and again. Each time, the path shifted more off course from anything that resembled a typical interstellar origin. Usually, these objects follow long, smooth arcs shaped by billions of years of drifting. But 3I/Atlas didn't drift. It cut. It left behind a straight, unnatural path with no sign of gravitational distortion. No influence from nearby stars, no evidence of planetary scattering. It moved like it was following instructions, a route, a line, a destination. Not like something thrown out of a collapsing system or ejected from a binary star dance. The deeper scientists looked, the more impossible the story became. The object didn't just lack a home, it lacked a history. Its trajectory didn't match the gravitational pull of any known star. It didn't align with any dense cluster or any region known for planetary formation. It didn't come from a nursery of new stars. It didn't come from a dead system. It didn't come from anywhere we've ever catalogued. It came from emptiness. Raw, cosmic emptiness. One researcher described it like this: it's as if the object came from a blank page. And in astronomy, blank pages don't exist. Even the darkest stretches of space have fingerprints, radiation trails, drifting dust, the signatures of ancient collisions. But the region 3I/Atlas seemed to originate from was too empty, too clean. Nothing forms there. Nothing evolves there. Nothing survives there. So the question became even more unsettling. Did it come from a place we can't see? Or a place that isn't supposed to exist? As analysts pushed the trajectory tens of thousands of years into the past, a new complication appeared. The path intersected nothing. Not a star system, not a cluster, not a nebula, not even a rogue planet, just darkness. But not the darkness of space filled with hidden matter. This was emptier, colder, like the object moved through a corridor untouched by the forces that shape galaxies. That idea alone broke models. Objects don't travel in perfect straight lines across millions of years. They get pulled, bent, thrown, torn. But 3I/Atlas kept its line, so neatly that some researchers started asking the most forbidden question. What if the path wasn't random? Because when you trace its route far enough back, you notice something else. Something the world wasn't ready to hear. The object didn't come from the gravity well of a star. It came from between wells, between the influence of galaxies, between the shaping forces of cosmic structures. It came from the void. Not space as we know it, not emptiness filled with dark matter, but the deep void. Regions so empty that even galaxies avoid them. Places where time stretches differently. Places that barely exist in our maps of the universe. No natural object should be able to originate there. Not without being destroyed. Not without losing stability. Not without drifting off course. But 3I/Atlas didn't drift. It chose a line so straight, so committed, that it looked less like a journey and more like a mission. That's when another layer of fear entered the conversation. If the object has no birthplace, then maybe it wasn't born. Maybe it was created. Built somewhere the universe itself avoids. Launched from a region with no stars. Sent along a route that nothing else could survive. And suddenly, scientists found themselves confronting a question they never imagined asking. What kind of civilization places an object in the deep void and sends it across the galaxy on a perfect line? Even stranger, why send it here? Toward our sun, toward our system, toward this moment in time. Some argued it was coincidence, a cosmic, accident. Others disagreed. They pointed to the heartbeat pulses, the silent gaps, the shifting panels, the geometric map, the engineered reflectivity. Nothing about the object behaved like nature. Nothing about it suggested randomness. Everything about it suggested purpose. And that left only two possibilities. Either 3I/Atlas came from a civilization so old it no longer has a home, or it came from somewhere that was never meant to be a home in the first place. A place outside the rules we understand. A place beyond the architecture of stars. A place where objects are built, not born. As the world struggled to make sense of it, one question lingered in every mind. How does something enter our solar system without an origin? Unless the origin is something far older, far stranger, and far more deliberate than anything we've ever imagined. The next chapter dives into the theory scientists tried to avoid, the theory that takes all these behaviors and forms a single, terrifying conclusion. 3I/Atlas might not be an object at all. It might be a machine. There are moments in science when the truth becomes too heavy to ignore. Moments when the data stops whispering and starts pointing toward a conclusion no one wants to say out loud. And for a small circle of scientists watching 3I/Atlas from rooms filled with glowing screens and sleepless eyes, that moment had finally arrived. For months, they had tried to fit the object into every natural category they knew: comet, asteroid, fragment, wanderer. But the tilt, the pulse, the silence, the heat panels, the reflectivity, the geometric trail, the lack of origin, none of it matched anything born from nature. Nothing behaved like that. Nothing moved like that. Nothing evolved like that. Unless it wasn't natural to begin with. One night, behind closed doors, a scientist who had been silent for weeks finally exhaled and spoke the words everyone else had been avoiding. What if we're not watching a comet? What if we're watching a machine? The room went still. Not shocked. Not confused. Just quiet. Like each person had been holding that same idea in the back of their mind, too afraid to say it first. Because once you name the unthinkable, you can't take it back. The group began laying out the evidence, one piece at a time. The tilt. That tiny sideways motion that broke the ecliptic with no force acting on it. If it wasn't caused by gas jets, or rotation, or gravity, then what moved it? Machines move themselves. Probes adjust their course. Guided objects correct their path. The pulse. That perfect 91-second heartbeat that sped up near the sun. Not random, not faulty, not decaying. Machines use timing. Machines communicate in cycles. The silence. That razor-sharp gap between each burst of light. No wobble. No fading. Just a clean pause. Machines pause. Machines reset. Machines wait. The heat. The shifting thermal zones that rotated like panels opening and closing. No comet has panels. Machines do. The reflectivity. Those sharp, angled bursts that acted like mirrors. Not dust. Not rock. Surfaces. Smooth. Intentional. Synthetic. The geometric trail. The grid stretching behind the object like a message written in movement. Nature doesn't draw rectangles in the sky. But machines? Machines follow instructions with precision. And then the origin problem. The path leading back to nowhere. Not a star system. Not a cluster. Not a birthplace, but a void. A quiet, empty region where nothing is born and nothing should survive. Unless it wasn't born there. Unless it was deployed there, placed there, sent from somewhere we don't understand. Piece by piece the puzzle came together, and every piece whispered the same truth. 3I/Atlas behaves less like a comet and more like an ancient probe drifting through the dark on autopilot. Not a visitor, not a wanderer. A device built by something long gone or far away, or impossibly advanced. A relic traveling through space for reasons unknown. It wasn't drifting. It was following instructions. Instructions millions of years old. Instructions we had never seen before. And then another realization hit them. If the object was on autopilot, then its recent behaviors, every tilt, every pulse, every adjustment, were not random reactions. They were corrections. Something inside the object had woken up, checked its course, and made adjustments, as if realigning itself toward a destination. The tilt wasn't an accident. It was navigation. The pulse wasn't noise. It was communication. The heat patterns weren't reactions. They were system activations. The reflectivity spikes weren't accidents. They were surfaces exposing themselves to the sun, as if drawing power. And that led to the question that chilled the room. If this thing is a machine, what woke it up now? Why, after traveling untouched through the void, would it start adjusting itself? Inside our solar system? Why here? Why now? Why us? Some thought it was the sun. Its warmth, its radiation, its magnetic field. Like a switch designed to activate only near starlight. Others suspected gravity, a threshold crossed that triggered a new function. But one scientist, quiet, calm, and certain in a way that scared the others, asked a different question. What if it didn't wake up because of the sun? What if it woke up because it sensed something here? The room froze. Something here. On Earth? In the inner planets? In the solar system itself? Something the probe was programmed to detect? Something it was meant to find? Suddenly the behavior made sense in a way no one wanted. The tilt towards the sun, the increasing pulses, the synchronized heat, the shifting panels, the geometric messages. Like it was reaching out, scanning, searching, signaling, trying to connect with whatever triggered its awakening. A long dormant machine, finally feeling what it had been waiting for. And then another thought surfaced, a thought darker than anything they'd considered. What if it wasn't waking up, but being activated? Not by the sun, not by gravity, but by a signal, a frequency, a moment in time that matched something in its memory. A match that could have come from anywhere. The Earth, a satellite, a burst of radio, a fragment of code, a whisper in the void. Something we didn't even know we sent. That idea spread quietly through the group. Slowly, carefully, like a realization too fragile to touch. Because if the probe was activated, then we are not alone in this story. We are a part of it, a trigger, a catalyst, a destination. The chapter ends on the same question that filled every lab, every observatory, every scientist's mind. If 3I/Atlas is a machine, and something woke it up, then what is it about to do? The next chapter dives into the final transmission. We captured before the object slipped behind the sun, a message sharper and clearer than anything that came before. A message that pointed straight at Earth. Sometimes the most important message is the one delivered right before the silence. And for 3I/Atlas, this strange, impossible traveller from the deep void, that moment came just minutes before it slipped behind the sun. The world was watching. Every telescope, every radio dish, every scientist who hadn't slept in days. They all knew this was the last window, the final glimpse before the object vanished behind the sun's blinding light for hours, maybe days. If anything strange was going to happen, it would happen now. And it did. At first, the object looked calm, steady, almost peaceful. No tilt, no rotation changes, no flickering panels, no geometric flares, just a quiet, drifting body moving along its impossible path. But then, 5 minutes before solar obstruction, every instrument watching the object caught the same impossible spike, a pulse. But not just any pulse, the brightest, the cleanest, the sharpest signal 3I/Atlas had ever produced. It flashed across the sky like a razor of light, precise, powerful, intentional. And this time, there was no silence after it. Instead, the brightness held. It stretched, it grew, it sharpened into something that didn't feel like a heartbeat anymore. It felt like a message. Analysts panicked, not in fear, but in awe. Data streamed across servers, so fast the numbers blurred, spectral sensors overloaded, filters burned out. But the pattern kept coming. Not a random flare, not a natural reaction, a repeating shift, a code. Something cycling through frequencies in a pattern humanity had never seen before. Smooth jumps, perfect intervals, a rhythm inside the rhythm. Like the object wasn't just flashing, it was speaking. One scientist described it as a language hidden in brightness. Another called it structured light. But most said nothing at all, because the realization hit them like a cold wave. This was not a malfunction. Not a glitch. Not a dying flare. This was deliberate. A final transmission before vanishing behind the sun. The signal repeated 3 times. Sharp, rising, geometric pulses followed by a sudden shift in frequency and direction. The direction part was what terrified everyone. Because as the models ran, as coordinates updated, as the angles recalculated, the signal was aligning directly, perfectly toward Earth. Not toward the sun, not toward empty space, not toward its old trajectory, toward us. The realization spread through every control room watching the object. It's pointing at Earth. It's aiming at Earth. It's communicating with Earth. But why? And what was the message? Teams scrambled to decode it, to pull meaning from the frequency shifts and brightness cycles. The pulse wasn't random, not even close. The first rise was slow, steady, like a greeting. The second was sharper, more urgent, like a call. The third was complex, a cascading pattern that looked eerily similar to the geometric grid the object had drawn across space. A pattern of lines, angles, ratios, like a map or a signature or a key. Then came the shift, the part that no one could explain. The brightness dipped into a wavelength that didn't match anything natural, a narrow, exact band of light that looked engineered. This was the part that made researchers lean forward with their hands shaking. Because engineered light doesn't come from comets. It comes from devices. And that device was looking at us. The signal held for 8 seconds, long enough for telescopes to capture thousands of readings, long enough for every scientist to feel the weight of the unknown settle onto their chest. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the brightness collapsed. Not faded, not dimmed, collapsed, like a switch turned off, and 3I/Atlas slipped behind the sun, gone from sight, gone from view, gone from every instrument except the ones waiting for the other side. Scientists stared at empty screens with the same unspoken question. What was that? A warning? An alert? A final check-in? An activation signal? Or something else entirely? A few believed it was a distress call, a dying machine sending one last cry into the solar system. Others believed it was recognition, that whatever intelligence built it had finally detected Earth and reached out. But a small group, the same group who whispered machine first, noticed something darker. The signal didn't just point at Earth. It targeted a specific point in Earth's orbit, a point Earth is moving toward, a point Earth will reach soon, a rendezvous point. The thought hit them like a punch. What if it wasn't sending a message, but marking a location, a meeting place, a destination, a return point? And if that was true, if the signal was marking a coordinate, then the object isn't leaving. It's waiting, waiting for Earth to arrive, waiting for something on our planet to respond, waiting for the next step of a plan millions of years old. Minutes after the signal ended, the sun consumed the object's view, and in that blinding light, a silence fell across the world. Not the silence of space, but the silence of realization, because the pulse wasn't random, and the alignment wasn't coincidence, and the brightness wasn't an accident. The last message from 3I/Atlas was aimed directly at us, and its meaning, whether a warning or an invitation, would not stay hidden for long. The next chapter reveals what happened when the object finally emerged from behind the sun, and why the silence that followed may be the most frightening clue of all. Sometimes, the loudest answers come from the things that suddenly go quiet. And when 3I/Atlas finally emerged from behind the sun, the whole world held its breath. Telescopes waited. Computers waited. Scientists who hadn't slept in days leaned over their screens, praying the object would return with the same strange heartbeat it had sent before disappearing into the sun's glare. But what they saw wasn't a heartbeat. It wasn't a pulse, or a signal, or a pattern. It was nothing. 3I/Atlas came out the other side, completely dark. No light curve, no reflectivity spikes, no shifting panels, no heat zones, just a silent, drifting shape, moving through space like every wild, impossible thing it once showed us had never happened at all. The object that had bent its trajectory flashed with perfect rhythm, opened its panels, traced geometric paths, and fired. One final coded message toward Earth was now empty, as if someone or something had turned it off. Scientists stared at the data in disbelief. The instruments weren't broken, the sensors weren't blind, the filters weren't burned. 3I/Atlas had simply stopped. The last known pulse, the brightest transmission it ever sent, was the final thing it ever did. After that came silence. Cold, perfect silence. Some expected the heat signature to return. Some expected the panels to shift again. Some expected another flash, another geometric trail, another sign of life. But the object drifted like a stone, like a body without breath, like a machine whose power had finally run out. And in that silence, a new fear settled across the scientific community. Not fear of what the object was doing, but fear of why it had stopped. Teams began comparing the alive 3I/Atlas to the one now floating through space like a piece of debris. The difference was too massive to ignore. When the object was active, its energy was sharp, focused, purposeful. Thermal patterns moved with intention. Reflective surfaces responded to sunlight. The pulse grew faster and more complex. Everything pointed towards something waking up, but now, nothing. Like a machine entering sleep mode. Like a device shutting down. Like a probe running out of tasks because it had completed its mission. That idea was the one that scared scientists the most, because missions have goals. They have steps. They have endpoints. And if the object had gone silent because it finished something, what did it finish? And what was the last signal aimed at Earth supposed to trigger? In labs across the world, scientists replayed the final pulse over and over again. The rise, the sequence, the frequency shift, the perfect alignment with Earth. Was it a warning? A goodbye? A handshake? An activation? A message that we simply haven't decoded yet? Or was it something darker? The object drifted farther and farther away from the sun's warmth, its dark surface absorbing nothing, reflecting nothing, just a silhouette against the endless black. It looked dead, truly dead. But the question no one wanted to ask crept through every research room. Like a quiet dread, machines don't just die, they wait. And the silence of 3I/Atlas didn't feel like the end of a story. It felt like the end of a chapter. A pause, a resting state, a device waiting for the next command. Something triggered its awakening as it entered the solar system. Something triggered its tilt, its heat, its signals, its map, its final burst of communication. And now, something else has put it back to sleep. The terrifying part is that no one knows what that something is. Was it the sun? Was it Earth? Was it time-based? Was it a cosmic instruction long forgotten? Or was it waiting for a reply that we didn't know how to send? Because if the last message was a question and Earth never answered, then what happens next? The object continued drifting outward, heading toward the edge of the solar system, where light becomes thin and silence grows thick. The same scientists who tracked its awakening now watched its fading form with a strange mix of sadness and unease. It felt like saying goodbye to something we never truly understood. Something ancient, something lonely, something that crossed the galaxy with a purpose we were never meant to see, and maybe never meant to interrupt. The world moved on. News cycles faded. Telescopes pointed elsewhere. But in quiet corners of research labs, a few scientists kept the question alive. A simple question, but one that carries the weight of the entire mystery. If 3I/Atlas turned itself off, what or who will turn it back on? Because nothing about this object was accidental. Nothing about its behavior was chaotic. Nothing about its silence was natural. It woke up for a reason. It signaled for a reason. It shut down for a reason. And somewhere out there, in the dark space between stars, in the deep void where it once came from, in the unseen places our maps don't reach, something else may be waiting. Something that knows how to wake it. something that knows what it is, something that remembers why it was sent. And if 3I/Atlas was a message, then somewhere in the universe, the sender still exists. Watching, waiting, listening. The object drifts on, silent against the black canvas of the sky. But the story it brought, the story in the light curves, in the heat panels, in the pulses, in the final transmission, that story is far from over, because the unanswered sky isn't empty, it's waiting. And now, so are we.